He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply picked up the phone, dialed two numbers, and by 6 the next morning, the most capable man in the building was on a plane to another continent. All because she said 3 words. He's incredibly handsome. That was it. That was the whole crime. A woman noticed that another man had good bone structure, and the most feared organized crime figure on the eastern seaboard quietly dismantled his own security infrastructure overnight and called it a promotion. If you've ever worked for someone who made you feel like you were walking on glass without knowing where the cracks were, if you've ever tried to figure out why the room went cold when you said something completely innocent, then you already know exactly what Vivian Hale felt standing in that office the next morning, looking at an empty desk that used to belong to the best bodyguard in the organization. She just didn't know it yet. So, before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes your coffee go cold because you forgot to drink it, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Vivian Hale had been working for Damien Moretti for 8 months before she understood that the most dangerous thing about him wasn't the rumors. It wasn't the whispered conversations that stopped the moment she walked into a room. It wasn't the way certain men in expensive suits would go absolutely still when Damien entered a lobby. The kind of stillness that isn't respect exactly, but something closer to self-preservation. It wasn't even the fact that she had, in her first week, accidentally opened a filing cabinet she wasn't supposed to open, seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and had that cabinet quietly replaced with a locked one before she came in the next morning without a single word ever being said about it. No. The most dangerous thing about Damien Moretti was that he was, by every practical measure, a reasonable man to work for. He was punctual. He expected punctuality. He didn't throw things. He didn't humiliate people in front of their colleagues. He paid well, significantly above market. And when he said he needed something by Thursday, he meant Thursday, not Wednesday disguised as Thursday with a side of panic. For a woman who had previously worked 3 years under a hedge fund director who once made his assistant cry in a parking garage over a misformatted spreadsheet, Damien Moretti's particular brand of demanding felt almost manageable. Almost. What made it complicated was the silence, not the comfortable kind. Not the kind that settles into a room when two people have been working together long enough to stop needing to fill every pause with sound. This was a different kind of silence. Precise, deliberate, the kind of silence that had texture to it. When Damien Moretti went quiet, the air in the room actually changed. She'd noticed it in her second week. By her 4th week, she could feel it coming 30 seconds before it arrived, like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. She had learned to work around it. Most things she had learned to work around. Vivian was 31 years old, had a master's degree in organizational management from a program she'd paid for herself, and had built a reputation among the small, specific circle of people who cared about such things as the woman you called when an executive's life was so operationally chaotic that it had become a liability. She had reorganized 3 companies, 2 law firms, and 1 congressional campaign before landing here, in the offices of Moretti Holdings on the 44th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, working for a man whose legal business portfolio covered 5 states and whose other business interests were discussed only in language so carefully neutral it might as well have been classified. She hadn't asked too many questions. She wasn't naive. She understood, roughly, what kind of organization she was adjacent to. But Vivian had also made a decision early in her adult life that she was going to be very good at one thing, and that thing was her job, and she was going to focus on that and not on the complicated moral architecture of who was signing her checks. She wasn't the only person in New York making that calculation. She told herself that regularly. What she had not told herself, what she had actively avoided thinking about, actually, was how much she had come to genuinely respect the man she worked for. Not admire. Not in the way people use that word loosely. She didn't have stars in her eyes about Damien Moretti. She'd seen him be cold in a way that was genuinely unsettling. She'd watched him end a business relationship with a handshake and a perfectly cordial smile, and somehow communicate with that smile alone that the other man should not be comfortable with how this ended. She had watched him do things that kept her up at night, occasionally. turning the memory over and staring at the ceiling of her apartment, wondering what exactly she was doing with her life. But she also respected competence, and Damien Moretti, whatever else he was extraordinarily competent. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when everything started to shift. Not dramatically, not with any warning at all, really. That was the thing about the moment that would eventually reorder her entire life. It arrived disguised as nothing. A Tuesday. An inspection report. A sentence that was out of her mouth before she'd had any reason to think twice about it. The morning had been routine by Moretti Holdings standards, which meant it had been busy enough that she'd eaten lunch standing up at her desk again and had fielded 11 calls before noon, 3 of which required her to be simultaneously diplomatic, firm, and deliberately vague in ways that required real concentration. By 2 in the afternoon, she was running on her 3rd coffee and had reorganized Damien's schedule twice due to a conflict with a shipping logistics meeting that kept expanding like it had ambitions. Adrian Knox had come in at 3:15. He was the head of Damien's personal security, had been for 4 years, she'd been told, which was longer than almost anyone else in that role had lasted. Vivian had worked alongside Adrian enough to understand why he'd kept the position. He was methodical without being rigid. He communicated clearly and without the territorial posturing she'd seen from other security personnel who tended to treat information as leverage. When he told her something she needed to know, he told her directly. When he didn't think she needed to know something, he said that too, plainly, without making her feel managed. She appreciated that. It was rarer than it should have been. He came in that afternoon for a quarterly security review, one of the routine inspections that cycled through every 90 days, covering the building's access protocols, the perimeter arrangements, the communication systems. Standard procedure. She had sat in on the meeting herself, as she did for most things now, taking notes on 2 items that would require follow-up scheduling on her end. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Adrian walked her through the report efficiently, answered Damien's 3 questions with the kind of specificity that made clear he'd actually read his own materials before presenting them, and left with the nod that managed to include both of them equally. Damien was quiet for a moment after the door closed, looking at the summary page. "How'd that go, in your view?" he asked. It was casual, the kind of question he occasionally asked her about personnel interactions, less because he needed her opinion and more because he was checking whether she'd noticed something he might have missed. He valued second sets of eyes. It was one of the things she respected about him, and Vivian, tired and coffeed and not thinking clearly enough, said the thing she said. "Good, really good, actually." She was clicking through something on her tablet, not looking up. "Knox is thorough. He knows his material." She paused, reaching for her coffee. "And honestly, it probably doesn't hurt that he looks the way he does. That man has genuinely got movie star looks, like objectively." She took a sip of her coffee. The room did the thing, the pressure thing, the barometric thing. She felt it immediately, even before she looked up. That particular quality of silence that she'd learned over 8 months meant something had shifted in a way that was not immediately visible. She looked up. Damien was still looking at the summary page. His expression was unchanged. He was perfectly still in the specific way that he got perfectly still sometimes, like a chess player who had just seen something 3 moves out that nobody else at the table had registered yet. He said. That was it. Just that. She put her coffee down, rewound the last 10 seconds in her head, felt, for the first time, the ghost of unease. Did I say something weird? No, Damien said. He set the summary page down, aligned it with the edge of the desk, and reached for his phone. You said something honest. That's not weird. She watched him for another second. He was already dialing. She told herself she was imagining it. She went back to her tablet. She was not imagining it. She didn't find out until the next morning when she arrived at 7:45, her standard time, 15 minutes before Damien, and found the desk outside the security coordination office already cleaned out. She stood there for a moment, looking at the bare surface where Adrian Knox's files had been, the empty hooks where his equipment was usually staged, the notable and specific absence of him. She went to find Marcus, the deputy security coordinator, and asked what had happened. Marcus looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not satisfaction, just something careful and contained. "Knox got transferred," he said. "Effective this morning." "Transferred where?" "Singapore," Marcus said. "Running the International Protection Division." Vivian stood there. "Since when?" she asked. "Since when was that happening?" "Since last night, apparently," Marcus said, and then he looked at her for just one beat too long before he said, "It's a promotion." The way he said promotion, with that half-second pause before it, lodged itself somewhere in her chest like a splinter. She thought about it all morning. She thought about it through Damien's 9 o'clock calls and through the board preparation meeting and through the lunch she ate standing up at her desk again. She turned it over in her head, the sequence. The inspection report, Adrian's departure, the things she had said, the silence that followed. She kept trying to find the alternate explanation, the coincidence, the pre-existing plan, the thing that made this make sense in a way that didn't make the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't find it. By 2 in the afternoon, she was sitting across from Damien going over contract language for a hotel acquisition in Chicago, and she looked up from the page and said, without planning to, "Did you transfer Adrian because I called him handsome?" The question came out more direct than she'd intended. She hadn't fully decided to ask it before she was already asking it. Damien didn't look up from the contract. "No," he said, just that, flat and even and final. She waited. Because she had learned over 8 months that sometimes the most productive thing she could do was wait. The silence lasted 6, 7, 8 seconds. Then Damien set his pen down. He looked up, and for just a moment she saw something cross his face that she had never seen there before. Not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had already decided to say something and was managing his own reaction to the decision. "I transferred him," Damien said, "because I didn't like the way he looked back." The room went very quiet. Vivian heard herself breathe. She processed what he'd said. The grammatical construction of it, the specific precision of the way he looked back. Not looked at you, but looked back, the return of something, the response to something she hadn't known she was transmitting. "He didn't," she started. "I know he didn't," Damien said. "That's not the point." She looked at him for a long moment. He was already picking up his pen again. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, appeared to be over. He had said the thing, and now he was moving past it, the way he moved past everything, with the contained efficiency of a man who had made his decision and did not feel the need to defend it, except this was the first time she had ever seen him make a decision that didn't make any logical sense. Damien Moretti was a lot of things, including several things she tried not to think about too carefully. But he was not, in her 8 months of observation, irrational. He didn't act on impulse. He didn't let personal sentiment contaminate professional judgment. She had watched him negotiate with people she was fairly certain he disliked enormously and give absolutely no indication of it whatsoever. The Adrian Knox transfer was not a strategic decision. It was a reflex. That realization sat with her for the rest of the afternoon, settled into her thoughts during her commute home, was still there when she was lying in bed that night looking at the ceiling. Because there was something almost more unsettling about an irrational Damien Moretti than a rational one. The rational one she could predict, navigate, understand within certain parameters. This one she wasn't sure what to do with. She fell asleep with the question still running. What she hadn't thought to ask, what she had no way of knowing yet, was whether the transfer was really only about her. Whether there was something else that Adrian Knox, in his 4 years of methodical and rigorous observation, had seen inside the Moretti organization. Something that made his presence inconvenient not just for Damien, but for someone else entirely. She didn't know that yet. She would. It took 3 more weeks for her to start noticing the other changes. Small things at first. The kind you dismiss once, maybe twice, before the pattern becomes undeniable. She was no longer assigned to coordinate from the outer office. She was now, officially, Damien's personal executive assistant, which in practical terms meant she was with him everywhere. Every negotiation, every charity gala, every board presentation, every closed-door strategy session where she sat with her tablet and her careful notes and tried very hard to look like a professional and not like someone who was increasingly aware that the most powerful man in the room kept track of exactly where she was sitting at all times. When she asked about the reassignment, he said it was for efficiency. She had learned enough about Damien Moretti to know when he was technically telling the truth about something while simultaneously being completely dishonest about it. It was at a fundraiser in the third week of November, a corporate philanthropy event in a hotel ballroom, 300 people in formal attire, the kind of event where the actual business happened in conversations at the edges of the room and the official program was largely theater, that she first understood with real clarity what had changed. She was standing near the bar, waiting for a contact of Damien's to arrive, when one of the executives from a partner firm, a man named Steele, who was handsome enough to know it and had apparently decided this was a relevant professional credential, appeared at her elbow and started talking to her. He was charming. He was smooth. He said 2 or 3 things that were actually quite funny, and she found herself laughing despite herself, and she made the mistake of being visibly comfortable in the conversation. She didn't notice Damien moving across the room. She noticed the conversation with Steele ending. She noticed the moment Damien was simply there, beside her, with his hand at the small of her back and a gesture so light she might have imagined it, saying something to Steele in a pleasantly calibrated tone that somehow communicated the end of a meeting that had never officially begun. She noticed Steele's expression shift, recalibrate, and then she noticed him excuse himself. The negotiation Damien had been in the middle of, the multi-million-dollar conversation she had scheduled and briefed and prepared materials for, was apparently over, 40 minutes ahead of schedule. "Did you just leave that meeting?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "The meeting was going in circles," Damien said. "It was going in circles because you left it," she said. He picked up 2 glasses from a passing server and handed her one. "You looked bored," he said. "I was fine," she said. "I was having a perfectly good conversation." "I know," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her stomach do something she immediately decided to categorize as indigestion. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had just walked out of a deal worth more money than she would see in a decade because she had laughed at another man's joke. She thought, this is a problem. She thought, this is going to get someone hurt. She thought, I need to figure out what exactly is happening here before it gets worse. What she didn't think, what she had no frame of reference yet to think, was that it was already worse than she knew, that the problem wasn't Damien's attention, that somewhere in a rival organization that had been watching Moretti Holdings for months, someone had noticed the same thing she was only just beginning to notice, that Vivian Hale had become, without meaning to, without wanting to, the one visible crack in an otherwise impenetrable man, and that somebody was already thinking about how to use it. She started keeping a list. Not on paper. She wasn't that careless. In her head, in the specific compartment she reserved for things that needed to be tracked without being spoken aloud. Every incident, every moment that felt like 1 degree warmer than professional, every time she caught one of the other men in the organization watching her with an expression that wasn't quite about her but was somehow about Damien and her simultaneously. She cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, methodically, without sentiment, with the practical understanding that information was only useful if you actually organized it. The list was getting long. It was the first week of December when she decided to say something directly, which was her nature and had always been her nature, and was the quality that had gotten her both hired and into more professional trouble than anything else in her adult life. She was not a woman who could sustain a pretense for very long before the pretense started to feel physically uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that were 1 size too small. She could do it for a day, maybe 2. After that, it started to cost her something she couldn't afford to keep spending. She waited until a Tuesday morning when the schedule had a genuine gap, 40 minutes between a call and a property review, no assistants nearby, no meetings bleeding over. She set a file on his desk, sat down without being asked, and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make it weird after. Damien looked up from his phone. He set it down with the particular precision that meant he was actually paying attention. All right, he said. What's happening, she said carefully, between you and me, in terms of how you're behaving, is starting to affect the organization. Nothing moved in his face. She pressed forward. 3 people have come to me in the last 2 weeks with questions they should have taken directly to you. They came to me instead because they've decided, for some reason, that I'm a proximity to you, a channel. And that's not my job, and it's not good for anyone, and I think you need to know it's happening. Damien was quiet for a moment. What kind of questions? The kind people ask when they're trying to figure out where the power actually is, she said. And the answer they're getting, apparently, from watching you operate, is that it's somewhere near me, which is insane and also dangerous. And also, she stopped, took a breath. It's going to cause problems I'm not equipped to handle. He looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that wasn't passive, that was him actually processing something, running it against whatever internal framework he used to evaluate information. She'd learned to recognize it. It looked like stillness, but it wasn't. It was closer to calculation at a speed most people couldn't follow. You're right, he said finally. She blinked. She had prepared for more resistance than that. Okay, I'll address it. How? Internally, he said, and picked up his phone again, which was his way of closing a conversation he'd decided was complete. She stayed in the chair for one beat longer than she needed to, just to register that she wasn't finished, even if he was, and then she stood up and went back to work. She told herself that was a productive conversation. She told herself things would adjust now. They did not adjust. What happened instead was that Damien became more careful, which was not the same thing as less attentive. He stopped doing the visible things, stopped personally adjusting her chair before meetings, stopped intercepting conversations at social events with that transparent deliberateness. He became subtle about it, which was in some ways more unnerving, because subtle Damien Moretti was something she couldn't point to and name. She could only feel it operating at the edges of everything. This particular quality of awareness directed at her, constant and wordless, and impossible to confront because it left no fingerprints. The other men felt it anyway. You couldn't hide a thing like that from people who were professionally trained to notice everything. It was Marco Ricci who finally said it out loud. Marco was Damien's financial strategist, mid-40s, sharp in the way that accountants who worked for men like Damien had to be sharp, which was a different kind of sharp than an ordinary accountant. He had been with the organization for 11 years. He was not a dramatic person. He was the opposite of dramatic. Which was exactly why, when he stopped Vivian in the corridor outside the conference room one Thursday afternoon and said quietly, "You understand what you've become to him, don't you?" It landed with considerably more weight than it would have coming from someone prone to speeches. She looked at him. "Excuse me?" "I'm not criticizing you," Marco said immediately, hands slightly raised, the gesture of a man establishing that he is not the threat in this corridor. "I'm genuinely asking, because you're smart, and I think you might not be seeing it clearly because you're in it." She kept her voice level. "Seeing what clearly?" Marco glanced down the corridor, both directions, then back at her. "He reorganized the entire Chicago expansion timeline last week," he said. "Not for strategic reasons, because the original timeline would have required you to be in Chicago for 3 weeks, and he had a problem with that." She stared at him. 12 years, Marco said. "I have watched this man make decisions. He doesn't do things for personal reasons. He never has. Until recently." He paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually something very significant. And the people outside this organization, the people who watch us for vulnerabilities, they're going to notice it before he does." She heard herself ask, "Who's noticing?" "Castellan family's been quiet for 6 months, Marco said. "Too quiet. After the port deal fell through, I expected noise. There was no noise." He held her gaze. "Quiet is worse than noise. Quiet means someone's watching and waiting and figuring out the right angle." He walked away before she could respond. She stood in the corridor for a moment with his words arranging themselves in her head in an order she didn't like. The Castellan family. She'd heard the name twice in conversations she hadn't been meant to hear and had been professional enough to pretend she hadn't heard. A rival operation out of Chicago, older money, older methods, the kind of organization that moves slowly because it could afford to. She didn't know the details and had actively avoided knowing the details, because the more she knew, the more she was in it, and she had always maintained a careful, somewhat fictional distance from the specific nature of what Moretti Holdings was behind the curtains. That distance was starting to feel very thin. She found Damien in his office at 6 that evening, after most of the floor had cleared out. She shut the door behind her, which she didn't usually do, and he looked up from his desk and read the closed door correctly. "The Chicago timeline," she said. He set his pen down. "Marco told you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Marco told me." She stayed standing. "Damien, you restructured a 9-month expansion plan. The original timeline had structural weaknesses," he said. "The structural weakness," she said evenly, "was that I'd have been in Chicago." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either, which was confirmation enough, and they both knew it. And the fact that they both knew it and were now standing in a room together with that knowledge between them was itself a new kind of problem. She didn't have a name for yet. "You can't do that," she said. "You understand that, right? You can't restructure a 9-month business plan because you don't want me out of your sight. That's not—" She stopped, restarted. "That's not who you are." Something shifted in his face, not anger, something quieter and harder to look at. "How would you know who I am?" he said. It came out without heat, just flat and honest and somehow worse for it. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "You know what I am professionally," he said. "You know how I operate, what I decide, how I run a room." He paused. "You don't know what I'm like when something actually matters to me. You've never seen it. Because in 12 years running this organization, nothing has." He stopped there, held the rest of it. She stood very still. The room was doing the pressure thing again, and this time it was coming from her own chest as much as anywhere else, which was new and uncomfortable and something she was absolutely going to process later and not right now. "That's not a reason to compromise the company," she said, because it was the only thing she could say that stayed on professional ground, and she needed to stay on professional ground or she was going to lose something she couldn't afford to lose. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She waited for more. "I'll fix it," he said. She nodded once, turned to go. "Vivian," she stopped with her hand on the door. "Marco's right about the Castellan family," Damien said behind her. "Tell him I said to increase the reporting frequency to daily." She didn't turn around. "I'll tell him tomorrow morning." "Tell him tonight," Damien said. "Pia, please." The please was what got her. She'd heard him say it maybe 4 times in 8 months, and each time it cost him something. She could hear the slight recalibration around the word, the place where his particular brand of absolute authority had to step briefly aside to let something human through. She texted Marco from the elevator. She didn't sleep well that night. The Castellan intelligence reports started coming in the following day, and for the next week, Vivian processed them with the part of her brain that handled abstract information and tried not to think too hard about what they actually described. Surveillance patterns, communication intercepts, financial movements through 3 shell companies that Marco had flagged as potentially linked to operations she wasn't supposed to know about. She organized the reports, scheduled the response meetings, did her job. On the 8th day, one of the reports included a photograph. It was a long lens photograph, slightly grainy, taken from across a street. It showed Damien walking toward a building entrance. Beside him, close beside him, the way 2 people walked when one of them was responsible for the other's safety, was Vivian. It had been taken 3 weeks ago, outside the courthouse after the Meridian acquisition hearing. Someone had been watching them for 3 weeks, and she hadn't noticed, and the detail that made her stomach drop wasn't even the surveillance. It was the notation in the margin of the report, handwritten in a cramped, deliberate script. Primary vulnerability confirmed. Personal, not professional. She brought the photograph to Damien without a word, set it on his desk, watched him look at it. He was quiet for a long time. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Vivian, please sit down." She sat. He looked at the photograph for another moment, and then he turned it face down on the desk, deliberately, like a card being played and then removed from the game. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Who wrote that notation?" she asked. "That's internal analysis. That's our margin notation format. That's not Castellan handwriting. That's someone in this building. The air changed. She felt it happen, felt the thing she'd said land in the room and detonate quietly, sending out a shockwave that neither of them moved in response to, but that both of them absolutely felt. Because she was right. She'd been processing reports for 8 months, and she knew the annotation conventions in this office. The handwriting, the format, the specific abbreviated language of the margin note. It wasn't foreign intelligence. It was domestic. It was inside. Damien's face went very still in a way she had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression. The rigid stillness of a man who has just understood something and is sitting with the weight of it before he decides what to do. "Get Marcus," he said. Quiet. Very quiet. "Damien, get Marcus. And get Marco. And get them here in the next 5 minutes, and do not tell either of them why." His voice was completely level. The leveler it got, she had learned, the more serious the thing underneath it. She got up. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She found Marcus in the security corridor and Marco in his office, and she told them both the same thing. Damien needed them immediately. No details. She watched their faces as they processed the summons and saw the professional dread underneath both expressions. The particular look of men who had worked for Damien Moretti long enough to know what it meant when he sent for you without explanation. She walked back to the office and stood outside the door while the two of them went in, and she heard the door close, and then she heard nothing, because this office had been designed specifically so that nothing escaped through the walls. She stood there in the corridor. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the notation. Primary vulnerability confirmed. Personal, not professional. She thought about Marco's words in the corridor. "They're watching. Quiet is worse than noise." She thought about Adrian Knox, who had been transferred to Singapore because of a 3-word compliment she hadn't thought twice about. And she thought about the fact that wherever Adrian was right now, he was 11 time zones away from a building that apparently had a leak in it. She thought, he removed the one person who might have caught this. She thought, because of me. That thought sat in her chest like something cold and heavy, with all the weight of a thing she didn't know how to put down. The office door opened. Marcus came out first. His face was the color of old plaster. He walked past her without making eye contact, which was the most alarming thing she'd seen in the last 20 minutes, because Marcus was not a man who avoided eye contact. Marco followed, slower, and when he passed her, he stopped briefly, looked at her, and said only, "Lock your apartment tonight. Don't use your regular route home." Then he kept walking. She went back into the office. Damien was standing at the window. His back was to her. He stayed that way for a moment before he turned. "I need you to move," he said. "Move," she repeated. "Your apartment, tonight. I have a building, secure, managed by people I trust completely. You'll have a full floor." He paused. "It's not optional. I know how that sounds. I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "The threat assessment has changed. You're not safe at your current address. That's not sentiment. That's operational fact." She looked at him. She thought about arguing. She had the argument lined up. The autonomy argument. The professional boundaries argument. The "I am an employee, not a dependent" argument that she had been mentally drafting for weeks. She had every piece of it ready. She thought about the photograph. The margin note. Marcus's face. "One condition," she said. He waited. "You tell me everything," she said. "Not the sanitized version, not the version you decide I can handle. Everything." She held his gaze. "If I'm in this, I'm in it with real information. I'm not navigating blind." Something moved through his expression, not hesitation, something more like recognition. "That might not be something you want," he said carefully. "I didn't ask what I want," she said. "I told you my condition." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Starting with," she said, "who inside this building sent that photograph to the Castellan family?" The name Damien said next made her breath go short, not because she recognized it, but because of how he said it. With the specific controlled fury of a man who had just confirmed something he'd been hoping for months was wrong. And in that moment, standing in that office with the weight of everything she'd just understood pressing down on the room, Vivian Hale understood something else too. There was no version of tonight where her life went back to what it had been yesterday morning. The line she'd been standing at the edge of, the one between adjacent to this world and inside it, she had already stepped across it. She just hadn't felt it happen. She felt it now. And somewhere in a building across the city, a phone rang, and a man who had been watching and waiting and choosing his moment with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the anticipation more than the act itself. That man picked up the phone and listened for 30 seconds, and then said, quietly and with what sounded almost like satisfaction, "Good. Then we move." The name Damien had said was Reeves. Daniel Reeves, 38 years old, 7 years with the organization. Head of internal communications, which meant he controlled what information moved between which people inside Moretti Holdings and which information quietly didn't. He had been at Damien's right hand through 3 major expansions. He had been in the room for conversations that could have dismantled the entire operation if they'd ever reached the wrong ears. He had been in the room for all of it. Vivian stood in the corridor outside Damien's office for 40 seconds after she heard the name, doing the thing she always did when a piece of information was too large to fit inside her immediate comprehension. She held very still and let it arrange itself. Let the implications stack up in order. Let the full shape of it become visible before she reacted. 7 years. He had been inside this organization for 7 years. She went back into the office. "How long have you known?" she asked. Damien was standing at his desk. He hadn't sat down. People like him, she'd noticed, didn't sit when they were truly unsettled. Sitting was for controlled environments. Right now, nothing about this environment was controlled. "I suspected for 6 weeks," he said. "I didn't have confirmation until tonight." "6 weeks?" she said. She kept her voice level. "You suspected a mole for 6 weeks, and you didn't—" She stopped. "What were you waiting for?" "Evidence I could use legally," he said. "If I moved without it, his lawyers bury everything, and we lose the ability to prosecute any of it." "Legally," she repeated, and the word came out with an edge she hadn't entirely intended but didn't take back. Damien looked at her. "Yes," he said, "legally. Because the exit I'm building for this organization requires that I stop handling things the other way. That's not new information. You've known that's where we're headed." She had known that. She had known it in the abstract, in the way you know something that is true but hasn't yet required anything from you. Right now it was requiring something from her, which was the patience to understand that the man she worked for had been sitting on a potential catastrophe for 6 weeks in the service of a principle she actually agreed with, and had said nothing to her about it. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. The admission landed without ceremony. No justification behind it. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who understood he'd made a call that was wrong and wasn't going to insult her by explaining it away. She exhaled. "What does Reeves have?" she asked. "What has he given them?" "Movement patterns," Damien said. "Communication schedules. The Chicago expansion timeline, including the revised one. Personnel assignments." He paused. "Your schedule." The last 2 words arrived separately from the others. She heard them separately. "My schedule," she said. "For the last 4 weeks," Damien said. "Where you go, when, what routes?" She sat down then. Not because her legs gave out. She was not that person, had never been that person, but because she made a deliberate decision that standing up was using energy she needed for something else right now. "Okay," she said. "Vivian, I said okay." She pressed her palms flat on her knees. "I'm processing. Give me a second." He gave her the second. He was good at that, actually, at knowing when to stop talking. It was one of the things about him she had never figured out how to stop appreciating, even when she was frustrated with him, which was inconvenient. She thought about 4 weeks of her schedule in someone else's hands, 4 weeks of her routes, her timing, her patterns, 4 weeks of someone she'd nodded to in corridors, someone she'd handed documents to, someone who had sat in the same rooms she'd sat in. 4 weeks of him packaging her life into a file and delivering it to people who wanted to use it. She thought about the annotation on the photograph. Primary vulnerability confirmed. She had thought that annotation was about her, that she was the vulnerability. She understood now, sitting in this chair with her palms on her knees, that the annotation wasn't about her at all. It was about him. She was the instrument, he was the target, and she was going to be the mechanism by which someone finally got to Damien Moretti in a way that nothing else had managed. The knowledge sat in her stomach like something swallowed wrong. "All right," she said. "What's the plan?" "You move tonight," Damien said. "I'm pulling Reeves's access in the next hour, but doing it in a way that looks like a routine security rotation, so he doesn't know we're on to him yet. We need him in contact with the Castellan side for another 48 hours so we can trace the full communication chain. You're going to let him keep feeding them information." "Controlled information," Damien said. "Marco and I put together a false timeline this afternoon. Reeves will pass it on. They'll position based on what they think they know." He paused. "And then they'll be wrong about where we are." It was a clean plan. Elegant, even. The kind of thing that required a certain amount of cold-bloodedness to execute. The willingness to let a betrayal continue breathing for strategic purposes. She recognized it as the right call. It still made her skin crawl. "And me?" she asked. "You disappear from your current address tonight," he said. "As far as Reeves knows, the move is security protocol. Nothing specific. He passes that on. The Castellan side thinks we're being generally cautious, not that we're onto their specific play." She nodded slowly. "And Adrian?" The name landed in the room and did something to the air. Damien was quiet for a beat too long. "What about him?" he said. It came out careful. The carefulness itself was telling. "He was your best man," she said. "He's been gone for 3 months because of something I said, and something you did in response to it. And right now you've got a mole in your protection unit who has apparently been operating undetected, and the one person who might have caught it earlier is in Singapore." She looked at him directly. "I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because it's operationally relevant." Damien held very still. She watched him live with that for a moment, watched him do the things she'd seen him do before with information he didn't like, which was to absorb it without flinching even when the absorption cost him something. He was good at it. He'd had a lot of practice. "I'll reach out to Knox," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he agreed. She left the office at 8:45. She went back to her desk, collected the 3 files she'd been working from, shut down her computer through the full security protocol rather than the quick close she usually used when she was tired, and took her bag and her coat and walked to the elevator. Marcus was waiting in the lobby with 2 men she didn't recognize and a black SUV outside. She got in without asking questions. The apartment Damien had arranged was on the 23rd floor of a building 12 blocks east, smaller than where she lived but cleaner, with windows that didn't face the street and a door that had 3 locks and a security panel she was given the code to and told to change within the hour. One of the 2 men she didn't recognize came upstairs with her, checked every room without commentary, tested the panel, and left. She stood in the kitchen of a stranger's apartment with her bag on the floor and her coat still on and stared at the counter. Then she took her coat off, put her bag on the table, and made coffee because she needed to do something with her hands, and it was either that or scream into a dish towel, which she refused to do on principle. She didn't sleep that night, not really. She got horizontal for a few hours, which was the most she could manage, and she lay there in the dark of an unfamiliar room, listening to the building settle and thinking about 7 years. 7 years of someone sitting inside the organization, inside the rooms, inside the trust. 7 years of a face she'd seen in corridors, a voice she'd heard in meetings, hands she'd watched sign off on documents. She thought, how do you not know? How does someone sit inside your life for 7 years and you don't know? She thought, maybe you do know. Maybe some part of you knows and files it under something else because the knowing is too expensive. At 4 in the morning, she got up, made more coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her tablet and went through the last 3 months of meeting notes, looking for the moments Reeves had been in rooms with her, looking at what she'd said, what she'd handed him, what he'd seen. The list was long. It was very long. And the longer it got, the colder she felt. Not afraid, exactly, but the specific variety of cold that comes from understanding that you have been comprehensively and systematically watched by someone you considered furniture, Someone whose presence you'd stopped registering because he'd been there long enough to become part of the background. She was still at the table when her phone rang at 6:47. It was Damien. Reeves made contact with the Castellan side at 4 this morning, he said. He passed the false timeline. They're moving. She gripped the phone. Moving how? Repositioning their people to the locations in the false data, Damien said. They think we're going into a negotiation in Midtown on Thursday. They're going to use it. Use it how? A pause. One beat too long. Damien, she said. They're not planning a negotiation disruption, he said. They're planning an extraction. The word landed flat and clinical and terrible. They're going to take someone, she said. Yes. Who? Another pause. She already knew. She knew before the pause ended, before he said it, in the way you sometimes know things because the logic of a situation has only one conclusion and your brain arrives there slightly ahead of your willingness to acknowledge it. You, Damien said. The extraction target is you. She set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table. They're not going after you, she said. It wasn't a question. She was working it out in real time, saying it to hear how it sounded. They're going after me. Because taking me is the move that makes you irrational, Damien said quietly. Yes. She stared at the table. The Castellan family was not trying to destroy Damien Moretti through force. They had watched him long enough to understand that force would not work, that he was too well defended, too disciplined, too experienced at surviving direct attacks. So they had looked for the thing that made him something other than disciplined, the thing that made him human in a way he could not fully armor against. And they had found it. They had found her. The Thursday meeting, she said. The one in the false timeline. I need to be there. Absolutely not. Damien. She stood up from the table. Listen to me. If I'm not there, they know the timeline was false. They pull back, regroup, and come at us from an angle we haven't mapped. We lose the intelligence advantage we spent 48 hours building. The answer is no. I'm not asking for your permission, she said, and her voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she didn't soften it. I'm telling you the operational reality. They need to see me there. They need to believe it's real. That's the play. The silence on the line had a different quality now. Not the controlled silence, not the deliberate one. This was the silence of a man doing something she had never seen him do, which was genuinely struggle with two things at once that he couldn't reconcile. I know what I'm asking, she said, quieter now. I understand what it means, but you said you'd give me real information and let me make real decisions. That's what I'm doing. He was quiet for a long time. Knox lands at JFK at 11 tonight, he said finally. I'm not making any decisions about Thursday until he's here and we've all looked at this together. That's fair, she said. Vivian? The way he said her name, she'd started to notice there were different versions of it, different tonal weights depending on what was underneath. This one had something in it she didn't have a word for. Nothing happens to you. That is not a negotiable outcome. I know, she said. She meant it. She also knew, and she suspected he knew too, in the part of him that had spent 33 years operating in spaces where nothing was guaranteed, that not negotiable and guaranteed were two entirely different things. She got dressed. She went over the intelligence files for 3 hours. She organized everything she knew into a structure she could present clearly when Knox arrived, because that was what she did. It was what she was good at, and right now the best thing she could offer was clarity in a situation that was trying very hard to be everything except clear. At 2 that afternoon, she got a message from a number she didn't recognize. No greeting, no signature, just 11 words. Pretty women standing beside powerful men usually disappear first. She read it twice, put the phone face down on the table, then picked it up again and took a screenshot and forwarded it to Damien with 3 words of her own. They have my number. His response came in 40 seconds. I know. Don't respond. I'm coming. He was there in 22 minutes, which told her he had already been closer than he'd said. He came through the door with Marcus and 2 others she recognized from the building's security rotation, and the speed and compactness of the entry, the way they moved through the space, checked the windows, the panel, the stairwell access, made the abstract threat she'd been carrying all morning suddenly very concrete and very present. Damien came to where she was standing in the kitchen. He looked at her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, because she'd promised him honesty and herself honesty, and this was not the moment to trade in comfortable fictions. "No, but I will be." He nodded once. Something moved through his expression, something that had been trying to get out for a while and that he was, as always, managing with considerable effort. "Tonight we wait for Knox," he said. "Tomorrow we plan." He paused. "But first I need to show you something." He pulled out his phone, opened a document, held it out to her. She looked at it. It was a financial record. Transfers, dates, account numbers running down the page in clean rows. It took her about 8 seconds to understand what she was looking at, and when she did understand it, the cold she'd felt at 4 in the morning returned, but deeper this time, settling into something that wasn't going to warm easily. The transfers didn't lead to the Castellan family. They led to someone inside Moretti Holdings. Not Reeves. The account structure was different, routed differently, through a different set of shells. Someone else. Someone who had been receiving payments for considerably longer than 7 years. Someone who had arranged for Reeves to take the fall. Someone who had known Adrian Knox was getting close, who had seen it coming months before Vivian ever opened her mouth about movie star looks, and had used her offhand compliment as the perfect instrument to remove the one man doing the actual detecting. She looked up from the phone. "The real mole isn't Reeves," she said. Damien's jaw was set in a way she had never seen before. Not angry, past angry. In the territory beyond anger where things become simply factual, where the emotion has been processed, and what remains is the cold decision of what to do with what you know. "Reeves is a layer," he said. "Whoever set this up put Reeves in position to be found, timed it so we'd find him right when we needed to. While we're managing Reeves, while we're repositioning around Reeves, the real architect is still in place, and we are looking in exactly the wrong direction." She stared at him. "They knew we'd find Reeves," she said slowly. "That was the plan. Reeves was meant to be found." "Yes." "Which means the false timeline we fed through Reeves." "The real mole already knows it's false," Damien said. "The Castellans moving on Thursday, that might not be because they believed our false data. That might be because someone told them we'd given Reeves false data." He stopped. "The extraction attempt on Thursday might not be a response to the false timeline at all. It might be the original play running on schedule, unaffected by anything we've done." She stood very still. Every move they had made in the last 48 hours, every carefully managed piece of the response, the controlled information, the false timeline, the decision to let Reeves run for another 48 hours, all of it had been visible to someone they hadn't found yet. All of it had been observed and accounted for by an architecture that had been running longer and deeper than anything they'd mapped. She felt, for the first time since this started, something that was genuinely close to fear. Not for herself, or not only for herself. For the scope of it, for the years it represented, for the patience it required. Whoever had built this had been building it for a very long time. "Knox," she said, "when Knox was here before the transfer, what was he working on?" Damien looked at her. "He'd flagged an anomaly in the financial rotation," he said quietly. 6 months ago. He'd been tracing it. "And then he was transferred." "And then he was transferred," Damien said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the compliment she'd paid. The 3 words. Movie star looks. The silence that followed. The transfer that came next, so fast it hadn't even allowed for a proper handover. The elegant, perfect convenience of it. A jealous man's impulsive decision, arriving right at the moment when the man being transferred was the only person close to uncovering something that someone very powerful needed to stay buried. "Someone knew," she said. "Someone knew you'd react that way. Someone who had been watching you long enough to know exactly what you'd do if you felt—" She stopped. "If I felt something I couldn't control," Damien said. The words came out level, but the levelness cost him. She could see it cost him. "They used it," she said. "They were waiting for it. And when I said what I said, they made sure it reached you in the right way at the right moment to guarantee the reaction they needed." The room was very quiet. Damien Moretti, who had spent his entire adult life believing that emotions were the enemy of survival, stood in a small kitchen on the 23rd floor of a building he owned and understood, fully, completely, with no available argument against it, that the one moment he had allowed something personal to override his judgment had been engineered by someone who knew him well enough to engineer it. That the transfer of Adrian Knox was not the consequence of his jealousy, it was the objective. He set his phone down on the counter. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and she saw in his face something she had never expected to see there. Not rage, not calculation, not the contained precision of a man who has everything managed. She saw the look of a man who has just understood that the version of himself he trusted most had been turned against him, and that there was no clean way to be angry about it because the fault was his own, and there was no one to hand that to. Adrian Knox walked through the door at 11:53 that night, looking like a man who had not slept on the plane because he had spent the flight reading everything he'd brought with him, which was considerable. He was carrying a bag that was too light for a man who'd just crossed 11 time zones, which told Vivian he hadn't gone back to his apartment first. He'd come directly from the airport. He looked at Damien when he walked in, and the look contained several things that weren't spoken and probably weren't going to be spoken, and then he looked at Vivian and said simply, "You're all right." It wasn't a question. It was an inventory. He was checking. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded once and set his bag on the table and opened it and started pulling out files. And that was that. 4 words. Inventory complete. Professional mode engaged. She appreciated the economy of it more than she could have explained. The 3 of them worked through the night. Knox had not been idle in Singapore. The anomaly he'd flagged 6 months ago, the one that had been quietly noted and not yet acted upon when his transfer came through, he had kept pulling at it from 11 time zones away, through channels he didn't discuss in detail, and that neither Damien nor Vivian asked him to. What he'd built over 3 months was a financial map that covered 7 shell companies, 4 offshore accounts, and a communication pattern that linked back through a chain of proxies that had been constructed with genuine patience and craft to a name inside Moretti Holdings that made the room go very quiet when he said it. The name was not Reeves. Reeves was a middle layer, as Damien had said, a buffer. A man recruited 18 months ago and positioned specifically to absorb this kind of investigation, to be findable, to be the answer that made people stop looking. The name Knox said was someone who had been in the organization for 19 years. Vivian did not know him personally. She had seen him twice, once in a corridor, once at the edge of a room during a board presentation. He was the kind of person whose function she had never had reason to engage with directly. Executive Director of Strategic Partnerships, which was a title that meant different things in different contexts, and in this context apparently meant the person who had been managing the systematic sale of internal intelligence to rival organizations for the better part of a decade. His name was Gerald Foss, 61 years old, gray suit, the kind of face you looked at and immediately filed under infrastructure, part of the building, not a person in it. He had been with the organization since before the legal side and the other side had begun the slow process of separating from each other. He knew where everything was. He had helped build where everything was. 19 years, Damien said. His voice was completely flat. He was patient, Knox said. He's been running very small extractions for a long time. Small enough that they looked like statistical noise in the financials. It wasn't until the Castellan payments scaled up that there was a thread worth pulling. Why did they scale up? Vivian asked. Knox looked at her. Because Foss knew the organization was restructuring. The legitimate side is going to separate from the other operations. That's been in motion for 2 years. Once that happens, his access to the kind of intelligence the Castellans are paying for gets significantly limited. He's monetizing everything he has left before the window closes. She sat with that for a moment. He's cashing out. He's cashing out, Knox said. And the Thursday extraction, taking you, that's the last big transaction, proof of capability. If Foss delivers Damien Moretti in a state of complete operational breakdown by demonstrating that he can reach the one person Moretti can't think around, that's worth considerably more than anything else he's sold them. The table was quiet. Vivian looked at Damien. Damien was looking at the financial map Knox had spread across the table. His expression was the kind that had moved past any one emotion and arrived somewhere that she didn't have a clean word for. the face of a man reconciling 19 years of trust with 19 years of its absence. "Where is he now?" Damien asked. "His apartment on the Upper East Side," Knox said. "He hasn't moved unusually. He doesn't know we have this." He paused. "He thinks the Reeves track is still live. He thinks we're 3 steps behind." "He thinks he has until Thursday," Vivian said. "Yes." "Then Thursday is when we take it back," she said. Both men looked at her. She looked back at them steadily. "Foss needs the extraction to happen to close his transaction with the Castellans. If the extraction doesn't happen, if I don't show up where they expect me, he doesn't deliver, the deal falls apart, and he's left holding 19 years of evidence that Knox just spent 3 months compiling." She spread her hands. "We give him Thursday. We give him the location. We give him everything he thinks he's arranged. And then we make sure the thing he thinks is happening is not the thing that's actually happening." Knox was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about using yourself as the bait." "I'm talking about closing this," she said. "The right way. With evidence. With arrests. With Foss and the Castellan principals in a position where there's no ambiguity about what happened." She looked at Damien. "You said the exit you're building requires doing things legally. This is how you do it legally. You need them to move. You need them to expose the entire chain. And for that, they need to believe Thursday is real." Damien was looking at her in a way that she felt physically. "No," he said. "Damien, I heard the argument," he said. "The answer is no." "It's the right call, and you know it's the right call," she said. "That's why you're saying no the way you're saying it instead of telling me why I'm wrong." His jaw tightened. Knox looked at the table. "Knox," Damien said, "tell her why it doesn't work." Knox was quiet for a beat. "It does work," he said, without looking up. "Operationally, it's the cleanest play we have." The silence that followed had weight. Damien stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to both of them, looking at the city, and Vivian watched the line of his shoulders and recognized the specific tension in them as the physical manifestation of a man trying to make a decision between what was right and what he could tolerate, and finding the gap between those two things larger than he'd expected. She walked to where he was standing. She didn't touch him. She stood beside him and looked at the same window and said quietly, so Knox couldn't hear, "I know what this costs you." He didn't respond. "I know what I'm asking," she said, "and I know it isn't fair, but you showed me the real information and you let me make real decisions, and this is the decision I'm making." She paused. "I need you to trust me the same way you asked me to trust you." He was quiet for a long time. "If anything goes wrong," he said finally. "I know," she said. "No," he said. He turned and looked at her directly, and the thing she'd seen trying to get out of his expression for months was fully visible now. No management, no containment. "If anything goes wrong, I will burn everything down. The legal exit, the restructuring, everything. I will light all of it on fire. I need you to understand that when I say nothing happens to you, I am not speaking operationally." She held his gaze. "I understand," she said. "Good," he said, and turned back to the table. They planned through the night and into the gray early morning. Knox laid out the operation in careful pieces. The placement of the federal contacts he'd been cultivating through his time in Singapore, the communication chain that would bring them in at the right moment with the right documentation, the positioning of Damien's strike team in the locations that would be invisible until they weren't. The Thursday meeting at the Midtown address in the false timeline. A corporate tower with 17 floors and 4 stairwells, and a loading dock that the Castellan team would use for their approach. By 6 in the morning, they had a plan. By 7, they had a problem. The problem arrived in the form of a message, not to Damien, not to Knox, but to Vivian's phone, from a number she didn't know, 3 lines. "We know you found Reeves. We know Knox is back. The Thursday operation proceeds regardless. If Moretti involves federal authorities before the exchange is completed, Foss releases the full internal intelligence archive to 6 different outlets simultaneously. Every operation, every name, every location. She read it twice. Showed it to Damien, showed it to Knox. Knox read it and set the phone down carefully. "He has a dead man switch," he said. "If he doesn't confirm every 8 hours, the archive releases automatically." "Can you find it?" Damien asked. "Not in 48 hours, Knox said. Not reliably. Then we can't involve the federal contacts, Vivian said. Not directly, Knox said. Not yet. Which means Thursday runs without a federal net, she said. Which means Thursday runs without a federal net, Knox confirmed. She looked at Damien. Damien was looking at the 3 lines on her phone screen. He's good, Damien said quietly. Not admiringly, just factually, in the way you acknowledge a thing that is true even when you don't want it to be. He's had 19 years to prepare, Knox said. All right, Damien said. He set the phone down. Then we find the archive before Thursday. Damien, I just said, I heard what you said. He looked at Knox. You have 48 hours. What do you need? Knox thought for 2 seconds. Marco's access to the financial servers, 3 of my people from the Singapore division. I can have them on a plane in 4 hours. And Daniel Reeves. Reeves, Damien said. He built the communication channel Foss uses, Knox said. He may not know what he built it for, but he knows the architecture. If the dead man's switch is running through that channel, Reeves can help me find it. He paused. I need him cooperative. Damien nodded once. I'll make him cooperative. The next 30 hours were the most concentrated Vivian had ever worked. She did not sleep. She did not, if she was honest, think about sleeping. The specific quality of what they were doing had a compression to it that made time feel different, shorter, and longer simultaneously, each hour containing more than it should have been able to hold. Reeves, faced with the full documentation Knox had assembled, made the calculation that cooperation was his only viable path. He was not brave. He was not stupid. He sat in a room with Damien on one side of the table and Knox on the other, and he answered every question he was asked with the speed and completeness of a man who understood that the only thing standing between him and a much worse outcome was his usefulness in this room right now. The dead man's switch took Knox 22 hours to find. He found it nested inside a financial reporting system that Foss had access to through his strategic partnerships role. A piece of code so embedded in the routine architecture that it would have taken months to find without the specific structural knowledge that Reeves provided. Knox neutralized it at 4:47 Thursday morning, 6 hours before the scheduled extraction. He appeared in the doorway of the room where Vivian was working and said, "It's done." She looked up. "The federal contacts?" she asked. "Being briefed now," he said. "They'll be in position by 9. She nodded, looked at her tablet, looked at the time, looked at the address on the false timeline that was now also the real timeline, because the wheel was already turning and there was no version of this where it stopped without reaching its destination. "Then we're going," she said. She changed into the clothes she'd prepared, dark, unremarkable, nothing that would move wrong or catch on anything. She tied her hair back. She put her phone in one pocket and the small personal alarm Knox had given her in the other, and she stood in the bathroom of the safe apartment and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 3 seconds because that was all she allowed herself. She was afraid. She acknowledged it cleanly, the way she acknowledged everything, directly, without decoration. She was afraid, and she was going anyway, and those 2 things were both true, and neither of them canceled the other. She walked out into the main room. Damien was waiting. He looked at her. The full inventory look, top to bottom, the one that wasn't about her appearance and never had been. He crossed the room. He put one hand against the side of her face, brief and deliberate, and with none of the controlled distance he usually maintained between his personal and professional self. He held it there for 1 second, then he dropped it. "Stay where Knox puts you," he said. "Don't improvise." "I know," she said. "When you hear the first flash, get down and stay down. Don't move until you hear my voice specifically. Not Marcus, not Knox. Mine." "I know," she said again. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he stepped back and became, between one breath and the next, the other version of himself. The one she'd watched operate for 8 months, contained and precise and utterly without visible fear. The one that filled a room just by being present in it. The one that had kept him alive through things she was only beginning to understand the full scope of. The convoy left at 7:45. The Midtown Tower was a 40-story building that had been partially vacated for renovations on the upper floors, which was why it had appeared in the false timeline to begin with. It offered the kind of controllable environment that made an extraction look feasible. The Castellan team had done their reconnaissance. They knew the layout. They knew the entry points. They knew the scheduled arrival time of Damien's party, which was 9:15, and they had positioned themselves accordingly. What they didn't know was that Knox's 3 people from Singapore had been inside the building since 5 in the morning. What they didn't know was that the federal team had vehicle coverage on every exit. What they didn't know was that Daniel Reeves, in a room with Knox for 22 hours, had given them the complete Castellan communication protocol, which meant Knox had been listening to their internal channels since 6 a.m. What they didn't know was that Gerald Foss, who was supposed to be coordinating from a secure location 8 blocks away, had been followed from his apartment by 2 men Knox didn't introduce by name and was currently sitting in the back of a car that was not going anywhere Foss had planned to go. The convoy pulled up to the tower at 9:13. Vivian got out. The morning air was cold, genuinely cold, the kind that gets into your collar and doesn't leave. She walked toward the entrance with Marcus on one side and a man named Carver on the other, and Knox somewhere she couldn't see him, which was exactly where Knox was supposed to be. She was wearing an earpiece that she'd been told would stay silent unless something changed. At 9:17 it wasn't silent. Knox's voice, low and completely level. Castellan team is moving. 4 from the loading dock, 2 from the east stairwell. They're early. Adjusted timeline. They moved it. She kept walking. Her heart was doing something that wasn't quite what hearts normally did, faster and heavier simultaneously, each beat landing with more force than the one before it, the way a sound gets louder when you turn toward its source. Copy, Marcus said, beside her, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Damien, Knox said, you've got the 2 on the east stairwell coming up behind your position. She didn't hear Damien's response because the lobby door opened in front of her and the morning folded itself into something else entirely. The first thing she noticed was that there were too many people in the lobby. Not the Castellan team. They hadn't reached this level yet. Moretti's people, Knox's people, men she recognized and men she didn't, all of them suddenly very alert in a way that wasn't quite natural, the particular alertness of people who are waiting for the moment to shift from waiting to something else. The second thing she noticed was the sound. It came from the east side of the building. Not an explosion, not quite. A percussive pressure that pushed through the walls and settled in her sternum and made everyone in the lobby go completely still for exactly half a second before every person who was trained for this started moving. Marcus put his hand on her arm. Down, he said. Not yet, she said. Vivian. Knox said Damien's voice, she said. I wait for Damien's voice. The sound in the stairwell got louder. Shouts, not intelligible, just volume and direction, the acoustic signature of a corridor engagement, close quarters and getting closer. She heard glass somewhere. She heard something heavy hit a floor above her head. She stood in the middle of the lobby with her hands at her sides and her heart doing its new terrible thing, and she did not move. Then the east stairwell door came open. The man who came through it was not one of Knox's people. He was large, and he was fast, and he had covered half the distance between the door and Vivian before Marcus intercepted him, and what happened in the next 4 seconds she processed in fragments. The impact, the angle, the sound of it. Marcus going down harder than she expected, Carver moving. A second man through the door before the first one was fully handled. She backed up, measured, kept her eyes on the room. The personal alarm in her pocket was useless. Knox's people were everywhere, but everywhere was not here. Not in this specific second, not in the gap between the moment the plan had anticipated and the moment that was actually happening. The second man got past Carver. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was 6 feet away and closing, and her options in the next 2 seconds were exactly as limited as they appeared to be. And she was going to have to choose one of them. And she was choosing. She was already choosing when she heard her name. Not shouted, not urgent in the way you'd expect urgency to sound in a lobby where 2 men had just come through a stairwell door and Marcus was on the floor and the geometry of the room had collapsed into something unrecognizable. It came out controlled and close, and with the specific weight of a voice that had crossed a room very fast to be that close that quickly. Damien. He came from the west corridor. Not where he was supposed to be, not where the plan had put him, which meant the east stairwell engagement had moved him off his position, and he had made a decision in the space of seconds that overrode every tactical instruction Knox had given him, because Knox's instructions did not account for this specific configuration of threat and proximity and the particular way Damien Moretti's judgment stopped functioning by the book when the variable in the equation was her. He reached the second man before the second man reached Vivian. What happened next was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looked like anything from the movies. It was fast and ugly and physical in a way that made her breath lock in her chest. Two large men in a confined space with nothing elegant about it, just force and angle, and the animal mechanics of who could take more damage and keep moving. Damien took a hit to the left side of his face that snapped his head back and would leave a mark for weeks. He gave back something worse. The second man went down and didn't get up with any urgency. Carver finished with the first one. The lobby went, not quiet exactly, but differently loud. The sound of the engagement moving away from this specific point. Up the stairwells, across the floors above, Knox's voice in her earpiece running a rapid-fire position update that she processed with one part of her brain while the rest of it was focused on Damien, who had straightened up and turned to her and was breathing hard through his nose with his hand pressed to his left cheekbone. "I told you, West Corridor," Knox said in her ear, and the dry precision of it under the circumstances was so thoroughly Knox that she almost laughed, which told her something about what adrenaline does to the range of human response. "Copy," Damien said, not to Knox, just to the air, the single syllable of a man who has done something outside the plan and is acknowledging it without apologizing for it. He looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "I know," he said. "I can see that." The hand he'd had pressed to his cheekbone dropped to his side. He rolled his left shoulder once, testing it, not performing it, and then the operational part of him came back online fully, and he looked at Carver and said, "Get her to the secondary position. Now." "The secondary position is 2 floors up," Carver said. "Then take her 2 floors up," Damien said, and was already moving toward the east stairwell before Carver could respond. "Damien," she said. He didn't stop. She let Carver take her arm and guide her toward the elevator bank because arguing right now was not an available option, and she knew it, but she watched Damien's back until the stairwell door closed behind him, and then she watched the door for another 3 seconds after that, just standing there, being human about it, in a way she couldn't stop herself from being. "Ma'am," Carver said. "I know," she said. "I'm moving." The secondary position was a glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor that Knox's people had cleared before 7 a.m. 2 of Knox's Singapore team were there when she arrived, plus a federal agent she didn't know who introduced himself as Hartley and showed her credentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it in worse circumstances. She sat in a chair at the conference table and listened to the earpiece and watched the corridor through the glass and did the hardest thing she'd done in the last 48 hours, which was stay where she was put. The engagement went on for 23 minutes. She knew this because she watched the clock on the wall of the conference room and kept her hands flat on the table and counted the updates in her earpiece. Knox's voice, running the operation with the kind of methodical clarity that explained why Damien had wanted him back badly enough to make a phone call at midnight. Marcus. Recovered, back up, a little rough around the edges, but functional. 2 of Knox's Singapore people running a parallel track on the loading dock team. A federal intercept at the building's east vehicle exit that she heard but couldn't see. At the 14-minute mark, Knox said, "Foss is in federal custody. He's talking." At the 17-minute mark, "Castellan principals are secured. Loading dock is clear." At the 23rd minute, the earpiece went quiet in the specific way that meant the operation was complete rather than paused. Then, "Vivian," Damien's voice. "I'm coming up." She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 23 minutes. She didn't tell him she'd been counting. He came through the conference room door looking like a man who had been in a fight, because he had been in a fight, and he had the particular quality of stillness that comes after sustained physical exertion. The kind of stillness that is actually a body managing the aftermath of everything it has just demanded of itself. The mark on his left cheekbone had darkened. His shirt had something on it that she chose not to examine too closely. He was breathing normally, which told her the shoulder was probably fine. He looked at her sitting at the conference table with her hands flat on the surface. "You stayed put," he said. You told me to stay put, she said. Something moved through his expression that was too complicated and too private to name. Hartley stepped forward. Mr. Moretti, we have Foss in a vehicle outside. He's indicated willingness to cooperate with a full debriefing in exchange for consideration on— I heard, Damien said. He hadn't taken his eyes off Vivian. Give us a minute. Hartley looked at the two Singapore team members. Both of them found reasons to be somewhere else. Carver followed. The door closed. The conference room was quiet. Damien walked to where she was sitting. He didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at her, and the expression on his face, stripped of the operational overlay, stripped of the controlled precision, just what was underneath all of it after 23 minutes of not knowing, was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. You're all right, he said. It came out quieter than she expected. I told you I would be, she said. You told me, he said. Yes. She looked at his cheekbone. That's going to bruise badly. I know. You need ice. I know that too. She stood up from the chair. They were very close. The geography of the room and the moment had arranged it that way, and neither of them stepped back from the arrangement. Damien, she said. Don't, he said. I wasn't going to say anything dramatic, she said. I know what you were going to say, he said, and I need another 30 seconds before I can hear it and respond to it like a rational person. She waited 30 seconds. She counted those too. Then she said, It worked. He exhaled. Not quite a laugh. Something more exhausted and more real than a laugh. It worked, he agreed. Foss is in custody. The archive is neutralized. The Castellan operation is— Vivian. He said it the way he'd said it in the kitchen of the safe apartment, with that particular weight. I know what happened. I was there for what happened. I know, she said. I'm talking because if I stop talking right now, I'm going to do something that I haven't decided yet whether I want to do in a federal building with your entire security team 40 feet away. He went very still. She looked at him directly. 30 seconds, he said. You already used your 30 seconds, she said. He put his hand against the side of her face the way he had that morning, brief and deliberate. But this time he didn't drop it after 1 second. He kept it there. And she let him, and that was the decision she'd been working toward for 8 months without knowing she was working toward anything. And it felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already been true for longer than either of them had been willing to admit. You're going to tell me this is complicated, she said. It is complicated, he said. I know it's complicated, she said. I helped make it complicated. Yes, he said. You really did. She almost smiled. Adrian's going to be insufferable about this. Adrian doesn't know yet. He will in about 4 minutes when we walk out of this room, she said. He's been watching people for 20 years. He's going to know. Damien dropped his hand. He looked at her for one more moment with that unguarded expression, and then the architecture of everything else came back. Not the wall, not the controlled distance, but the weight of what was still ahead, the work still to be done, the things that a morning's operation had resolved, and the things it had only begun to resolve. We need to go, he said. I know, she said. They went. The next 6 hours were the most procedurally intensive of Vivian's professional life, which was saying something. Hartley and his federal team processed the building with the systematic thoroughness of people who had been waiting for this particular operation to conclude and were not going to let the moment be wasted by imprecision. Gerald Foss, in the back of a federal vehicle that was not going anywhere comfortable, had made the calculation that cooperation was his only remaining asset and was spending it with an efficiency that Vivian might have found professionally admirable under other circumstances. She sat in on 2 of the debriefing sessions, at Knox's request, because she had processed 8 months of Moretti Holdings documentation, and there were details Foss referenced that Knox needed contextualized quickly, and she was the fastest available resource for that. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, without sentiment, with the practical understanding that her feelings about Gerald Foss were real but not currently useful. She had a lot of feelings about Gerald Foss. She put them somewhere she could get to them later and did her job. By 4 in the afternoon, the federal team had what they needed. Hartley shook Damien's hand with the particular formality of two people who have just done something useful for each other while operating from very different institutional positions, and said things that were carefully phrased to acknowledge value without committing to anything specific, and Damien received it in the same careful register. Knox watched the exchange from across the room with his arms folded and an expression of mild professional appreciation. "That went well," Knox said when Hartley left. "For now," Damien said. "For now is enough," Knox said. Damien looked at him for a moment. The kind of look that carried everything the two of them hadn't said in the 4 hours since Knox had landed. The transfer, the months, the thing that Damien had done impulsively, and the cost it had carried, and the specific, uncomfortable fact that his jealousy had been the instrument of a conspiracy that someone else had engineered. Knox held the look without flinching. He was not a man who needed apologies to precede reconciliation. He was practical in a way that made him, in Vivian's estimation, one of the more functional people she had ever worked alongside. "Singapore was a good operation," Damien said finally. "It was," Knox said. "Better than what was happening here, apparently." "That's fair," Damien said. "I know," Knox said. "I'm letting you have that one because today was a hard day." He unfolded his arms. "Director of International Protection?" "If you want it," Damien said. "On your terms, not mine." Knox looked at him for a moment, then at Vivian, then back at Damien. "Her terms too," Knox said. "Obviously," Damien said. Knox nodded once. "Then, yes." The three of them stood in the cleared lobby of a midtown building that smelled like adrenaline and the specific industrial aftermath of a very bad morning. And it was not a triumphant moment exactly. It was too tired and too costly for triumph. But it was something. It was the particular quality of after that only arrives when something that has been building for a very long time has finally finished building and collapsed, and you are still standing in the wreckage of it, and that, for today, is enough. Daniel Reeves pled guilty 4 weeks later to 7 counts of corporate espionage and communications fraud. His cooperation had been substantial enough to earn him a reduction that his attorney called a victory, and that Knox, reading the sentence, called adequate. He was not wrong on either count. Gerald Foss went to trial. It lasted 11 days. The financial documentation Knox had assembled over 3 months in Singapore was, Hartley told Vivian afterward, the cleanest evidentiary record he had seen in 14 years of organized crime prosecution. Foss's legal team challenged 3 pieces of it and lost on all 3. The archive, the dead man's switch, the 19 years of extracted intelligence, was recovered intact from the server architecture that Reeves had helped Knox map, and became, in its entirety, evidence for the prosecution. Foss was convicted on 22 counts. On the day the verdict came in, Vivian was sitting at her desk in the newly renovated offices of Moretti Holdings' legitimate operations division. A different floor, a different configuration, a different relationship to the building than the one she'd had 8 months ago when she'd first walked through those doors. She got the notification on her phone, read it twice, set the phone down. She sat for a moment with the weight of it. 22 counts, 19 years. The man in the gray suit who had looked like infrastructure. She thought about the photograph with the margin annotation. Primary vulnerability confirmed. She thought about what it had cost. The months of exposure. The nights she'd spent in an unfamiliar apartment listening to a building settle. The 23 minutes in a conference room with her hands flat on a table counting seconds. She thought, it cost what it cost. She thought, and here you are. She picked up the phone and sent Damien a single word. Verdict. His response came in under a minute. I know. Come up when you're ready. She took 5 minutes she didn't strictly need because she had learned over the last several months of operating in the full reality of what Moretti Holdings was and was becoming, that the difference between her and the people she worked alongside was that she still needed 5 minutes sometimes, and she was no longer going to apologize for that or pretend it made her less capable. It made her different. Different was fine. She went up. The top floor had been reconfigured. The walls that had separated Damien's office from the broader executive space had been partially opened, not torn down entirely, but altered, adjusted, the geography of authority made less absolute than it had been. It was a small thing. It meant something. Damien was at his desk. He looked up when she came in and his eyes went to her face in the inventory way, checking, and she had stopped finding the habit unsettling and started finding it something else that she was still working on naming accurately. 22, she said. 22, he confirmed. How do you feel? She asked, because she genuinely wanted to know, and because asking it a year ago would have felt like a professional overreach. And now it didn't. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Tired, he said. Mostly tired. He paused. Relieved in a way that's going to take a while to catch up with me. That's honest, she said. I'm working on honest, he said. You've been a significant influence on that. She sat down, in the chair across from his desk, the one she'd sat in 100 times, the geography of it familiar in a way that was its own kind of comfort. The Chicago expansion, she said, resumes Monday, he said, with the original timeline. The one that had me in Chicago for 3 weeks, she said. The one that had you in Chicago for 3 weeks, he said, which is operationally correct and personally... He stopped. Personally what? She asked. Challenging, he said, in the tone of a man making a significant concession. Damien, she said, I'm going to be in Chicago for 3 weeks, and it's going to be fine, and you're going to let it be fine. I know, he said. And when I come back, we're going to figure out what the rest of this looks like, she said, the part that isn't work, properly, without either of us pretending it's simpler than it is or more complicated than it needs to be. He looked at her for a long moment. That sounds like a plan, he said. I make good plans, she said. You do, he said. That's not in question. She stood up. She had 3 meetings before end of day and a 4th call that she had promised herself she would not reschedule again. She picked up her tablet. She walked toward the door. Vivian, he said. She stopped, turned. Adrian wants to take us both to dinner tonight, he said, to celebrate the verdict. He paused. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he wants to formally witness the 2 of us being functional human beings in a social setting so he can stop worrying about it. She felt something in her chest that was uncomplicated and warm and the closest thing to lightness she'd felt in months. Tell him yes, she said. I already told him yes, Damien said. I was informing you, not asking. We're going to have a conversation about that distinction, she said. I know, he said. I'm told that's a significant influence in progress. She left the office. She was smiling before she reached the elevator, which she allowed herself because the corridor was empty and she was entitled to it. And the day was, when she considered the whole weight of it and set it against where she'd been sitting 8 months ago, actually and genuinely good. The dinner was at a place Knox had chosen, which told her it would be good food without being about the food, which was correct. It was a corner table in an Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the new offices that Knox had apparently been going to for years, which told her other things about Knox, about the life he maintained alongside the work, the specific ordinary pleasures he protected even when the work was extraordinary. They were there for 2 hours. It was not a dramatic 2 hours. No one said anything that would have functioned as a speech. Adrian ordered the wrong wine first and then the right one and didn't mention it. Damien ate more than she'd ever seen him eat in a professional context, which meant something about how much the last several weeks had cost him in the simple mechanical sense. Knox told 2 stories about Singapore that were funny without being designed to be funny, which was the best kind of funny. At one point, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd hour, she looked around the table at these 2 men, one who had been her boss and had become something she was still finding the vocabulary for, one who had been a stranger and had become, in the compressed way that crisis accelerates certain kinds of knowing, someone she trusted in a bone-level way that she didn't have to think about. And she had the thought that she sometimes had at unexpected moments, the one about how you cannot see the shape of something while you're inside it. You can only see it from after. From after, the shape of the last 8 months looked like this. A woman who was good at her job walked into a building and got better at her job. And somewhere in the middle of all the becoming better she became. Also, someone who had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated, and had found, in the testing, that she was more than she had known. Not harder. Not tougher in the way the word usually gets used, Like toughness is a substance you acquire. More honest, maybe. More clear about what she would and wouldn't carry, what she would and wouldn't be used for, what she was willing to put down, and what she would hold regardless of the cost. She had also, somewhere in that same 8 months, made the most inadvertent professional observation of her career by calling a bodyguard handsome out loud in front of the wrong person, which had set off a chain of events that had at various points terrified her, infuriated her, and ultimately led to her sitting in an Italian restaurant in Midtown with the two people she trusted most in the city, eating very good pasta. Life, she thought, had a genuinely chaotic sense of narrative structure. She said this out loud because the wine was good and the company was right for it. Knox looked at her. "That's accurate," he said. Damien said nothing, but the corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did when he found something funny and had decided not to confirm that he found it funny. "You're smiling," she told him. "I'm not," he said. "You absolutely are," Knox said. "Neither of you can prove that," Damien said, and took a drink of his wine. It was the most ordinary moment she could remember having in a very long time, and she held it carefully, the way you hold things that you know cost something to arrive at, and she let it be exactly what it was without needing it to be more. Later, walking back through the November air that had turned properly cold, the kind of cold that meant the year was getting ready to fold itself away and begin again, she walked beside Damien with Knox, a half step ahead of them, giving them the specific privacy of someone who has decided not to notice what he is choosing not to notice. "The thing you said," she said, "that night in the office, that in 12 years nothing had actually mattered to you." He glanced at her. "What about it?" he said. "I just wanted to say," she said, "that I understand now why you didn't tell me sooner, why you held it as long as you did." He was quiet for a moment, his breath making brief vapor in the cold air. "It wasn't strategy," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the thing I had to understand. It wasn't strategy. It was something else." He looked at her sideways. "It scared you," she said. Not accusatory, just true. He was quiet for long enough that she had already decided not to push it. "Yes," he said. One word, flat and honest and costly, in the specific way that honest things are costly to people who have spent a long time building the architecture of not needing to say them. "Me too," she said. He didn't respond to that, but the half step between them narrowed slightly and stayed narrowed for the rest of the walk, and that was its own kind of answer, which was enough. The Moretti Holdings restructuring concluded formally in February of the following year. The legitimate operations were fully separated from the historical criminal network, with a compliance framework that Vivian had spent 3 months helping to design, a process that required her to learn things about the organization that she had previously categorized as not her business, and to look at them clearly and help build the architecture of their dismantling. It was not comfortable work. It was important work. The distinction, she had found, was not always the same thing. The criminal network did not disappear overnight. She understood that, had always understood it, had made her peace with the incremental pace of the kind of change that involves 19 years of institutional weight. What she could see, from inside it, was the direction. The direction was right. That counted for something. She let it count for something. Knox's Director of International Protection role turned out to be exactly what it said, a position built on merit and structured to function independently of the kind of personal loyalty that had made the previous security arrangement vulnerable. He rebuilt the protection unit from the methodology out, with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 3 months in Singapore, understanding what a compromised unit looked like and having very specific opinions about how to prevent it. He came back from each international assignment with exactly the right amount of information and exactly the right stories, and he remained, in Vivian's assessment, one of the most functional people she had ever worked alongside, which was a quality she had come to prize above almost everything else. On the day the restructuring concluded, a Thursday in late February, cold and clear, the sky the particular blue that shows up in New York in winter when the air has been scoured clean, Vivian stood at the window of the offices that were now officially and legally and cleanly the headquarters of a legitimate company and looked at the city and let herself feel what she felt. It was not triumph. It was not the clean completion that movies traffic in, The version where everything resolves and the resolution feels proportional to the cost. It was something more honest than triumph. It was the specific satisfaction of work that mattered, done carefully by people who had chosen to do it even when it required more from them than they'd originally agreed to give. It was the knowledge that the building she was standing in was different than it had been 8 months ago, and that some part of that difference had passed through her hands. It was tired and complicated and real, and she would take it over the clean version every time. Damien came to stand beside her. They stood at the window for a while without talking, looking at the same skyline, the city doing the thing it always does in winter light, showing you its structure, all the scaffolding visible that the warmer seasons soften and obscure. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it looks different from here than it did 8 months ago," she said. "Does it?" he said. "Yes," she said. 8 months ago, I was thinking about how to organize a filing system. Now I'm thinking about—" She paused, looked at the skyline. "All the ways a thing can be rebuilt when you're honest about what it actually was to start with." He was quiet beside her. "That's a better thought than the filing system," he said. "Most things are better than the filing system," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it happen. "Damien," she said. "I'm glad I called Adrian handsome," she said. A pause. "I am not," he said. "I know," she said, "but without it, we're still wherever we were before. And wherever we were before wasn't this." He considered that for a moment in the serious way he considered things that actually required consideration. "That's an argument," he said. "It's the correct argument," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd first seen in the lobby of the Midtown Tower. Unguarded, uncalculated, the man underneath the architecture of everything he'd spent 33 years building to protect himself from exactly this kind of exposure. She had come to know it. She had come to be the only person in his particular world who saw it regularly. She understood what that meant. She had thought about it carefully enough to understand it fully, which was the only way she did anything. "Ready?" she said. "For what?" he asked. "The rest of it," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. And that was enough. That was in the specific language of two people who had arrived at something true through a year of everything that had tried to prevent it, more than enough. They left the window. They left the skyline to its winter blue. They went back to work, which was where they had always been best, and which was now, finally and honestly and without pretense, also where they wanted to be.